So good morning everybody, real pleasure to meet you. So my name's Nina from Champions for Social Change, and I love this time of year in Europe where we've planted all the seeds and the bulbs and suddenly all the flowers are blossoming. We've got the tulips that I'm going to be seeing on Saturday at Kirkenhof. And this photo is of the beautiful daffodils is taken outside the University of Greenwich, where I'm currently doing my PhD in London. And as I mentioned in the introduction, my PhD is looking researching the journeys of lived experience leaders from the UK, Europe, the USA and Brazil, so working and thinking about how they grow their national and global networks, so really relevant to what we're going to be talking about over the next 2 days. So I'm not actually very green-fingered, and I went to the garden centre last weekend to get some plants, and I had to ask the manager for some advice about what are the conditions for my plants to flourish. And they said, well, you need to water them a lot, you need to make sure they've got nutrient-rich soil, and you need to make sure that they're in plenty of sunshine. So I've got 3 things today that I want to talk to you about around how we make alliances flourish, like our plants and our flowers, so how they can blossom over time. So why set up an alliance? Like, from my experience, it is really hard work. It's really messy. Not everyone's always going to agree. And there's a lot of invisible work as well. There's a lot of relationship building, things that you don't have an output at the end of it, but that is super important to this work and takes time and patience. So I really like this model by the Picano Institute called the 2 loops model. And I think it explains really well why networks and alliances are really important. So here you've got the kind of the dominant system, the dominant paradigm, our punitive justice system. And how do we go about, bringing about this sort of emergent system that exists in these pockets of, around the world? How do we get that to be the sort of dominant system in the future? And what the 2 loops model talks about these sort of pioneers. So people in this room, the thinkers, the innovators, the pioneers in their space, need to come together and form networks and form communities of practice in order to connect, to nourish and to amplify this work and to bring about that system change, to bring about that kind of paradigm shift that we want to see. So that's why I think that networks are really important. This is a few of the networks that I've been involved in over the last 15 years. So the first one I set up was the Prisoner Learning Alliance. So I was tasked with bringing together lots of different players from civil society, from academics, from policymakers, people with lived experience of prison education, because there wasn't a combined vision about what does prison education look like, what's it for, what do we want the government to do. So we spent sort of 2 years doing lots of sort of co-creation work to pull that together, to come up with a joint vision. So then when that was a window of opportunity, a political window of opportunity, we were all on the same page. We'd had all the messy conversations, we'd had all the disagreements, we'd come together and had a way forward. I then was part of the European Prison Education Association, which some of you may have been a part of, and that allowed me then to branch out and connect our network with European networks and to see examples of work that was happening around technology, for example, in the EU. And then I was able to form some Erasmus partnerships as well, so we could collaborate more with our European partners. And then I joined part of something called the Churchill Fellowship, which is based in the UK, which is a network of change makers working in all different sectors. And I was able to go out to the US and connect and build connections with networks in the US, including going to Beyond the Bars conferences at Columbia. So it was great to hear about Beyond the Bars Africa, which I'd love to attend. So to build those connections with organisations in the US. Just a few other organisations and networks I've been part of. When we had the London 2012 Olympics, I was involved in setting up an alliance of organisations that were promoting sport in criminal justice. So it was bringing together the silo of criminal justice with the sports world, with football clubs, rugby clubs, the Department of Sport in government. Also arts organisations, alliances around race equality, youth justice and young adults. And then my last big role was working for an alliance called the Criminal Justice Alliance, which had over 200 civil society and academic members looking to over the whole criminal justice system, from policing, courts, prisons and probation, so with that really kind of wide view. So it's just very quick analysis of some of the alliances I've been involved with. And with all those alliances, what I've seen is this, what the INI Institute calls kind of different seasons. You know, not just running on our year season, but over the course of seasons, individuals, organisations and movements and networks will have these seasons. So the Global Alliance at the moment is this sort of internally focused phase. So as Olivia was talking about, we're at this stage where we're thinking about the values, we're thinking about the strategy, we're thinking, you know, that internal work, building those relationships, so with that kind of internally focused winter-spring. You know, you'll then move into the sort of the spring phase where you'll start to open up and to experiment and try new ways of working. The sort of the summer phase, it will be there where you're sort of confident and externally focused. But then will come a kind of an autumn as well, or a fall, where it's all about sort of the harvesting and understanding of what have we achieved, what do we need to do differently, and then you'll kind of come back into that more internally focused winter phase, which is that kind of regeneration. And also, as talked about, this is hard work, you know, for individuals, so it's important to have these different phases where we can rest, take time, and not always, you know, be fully on the go. So I think within networks, it's important to think about the different seasons and what sort of work is best for those seasons and for those individuals working within those networks. So I'm going to, for this, I'm going to call on my new friend, Dita, to help me with this section. So when I was in the US, I came across an incredible organisation called Just Leadership USA, and they have a motto, and I found out yesterday that Dita is an alumnus of Just Leadership USA, so I'm going to ask Dita to read out Just Leadership's motto, if that's okay.
No, sure. Those closest to the problem are closest to the solution, the furthest away from power and resources.
Yeah, so if you want to know anything about Just Leadership, come and speak to Dita. He's an alumnus of this incredible organisation. And I think a lot about this motto and what it really means, and a lot of my research is really focused on these three things about knowledge, power and resources. And so I think for today, these three things are things that could, you know, provide some backdrop for the conversations we're going to be having about sort of strategy. And I think there's a role for alliances in building, sharing and mobilising knowledge, power and resources. But what do we mean by knowledge? And this has been touched on a little bit this morning already. You know, who has knowledge, what is knowledge, and whose knowledge is valued? So, you know, amongst the group we'll have a combination, as we've already heard this morning, and people will bring more than one perspective or lens to this knowledge, that lived expertise, that embodied, you know, felt the impacts, you know, personally or through a family member, as we've heard today. That learned expertise, whether that's sort of reading about something, whether that's researching something and thinking critically about prisons. And then that professional expertise, whether that's in practice and practice-focused roles or advocacy roles, that sort of bring that professional experience. And like I said, many will bring more than one of those lenses together. And I just wanted to kind of bring up this phrase around knowledge equity. So this idea that actually, I think alliances need to have a commitment and a focus, has already been said by Olivia this morning, to thinking about whose knowledge hasn't been valued in the past. How do we centre that knowledge? How do we ensure that people whose knowledge has been excluded in the past become central to what we do? And I think thinking on a global level, there's also that sort of, you know, global north, global south divide. You know, which countries are not being heard, which regions are not being heard, and how do we uplift their voices and ensure that we have this knowledge equity? And I think we can do that as an alliance in three ways. One has already been spoken about this morning, kind of curation. So I think there's something really important about the work, and we've already heard about this with the, you know, what's been done to really think carefully about how these next 2 days are planned out. How do we ensure that spaces are safe and inclusive, and people feel more comfortable in those spaces? How do you curate that? And even this morning, when every individual was given a turn to talk and share a little bit about their stories, I think those check-ins and check-outs are super important to share those stories and turn from kind of transactional relationships. It can be really easy just to get into the meat of the the content without having a bit of informal time to learn about who each other are as humans. So it turns those kind of transactional relationships into transformational relationships. And this is what I was saying earlier about invisible work. The relationship building is the work, alliances. So curating those safe spaces. Co-creation has already been mentioned this morning as well. So how can we co-create together? And I think there's something with alliances about finding cross-cutting themes. So when I worked at the CJA, we did a lot of work, rather than focusing on policing or prisons or courts, how do we break down those silos and bring people working in all these different spaces together? And what I found worked well was thinking about things like trust. So we did a big sort of co-creation project about trust in the criminal justice system. What does that look like? Where is it broken? What builds trust? Where do we go from here? Where are some positive examples of building trust? So that we can start to kind of see the whole big picture, that helicopter view, together, so kind of co-creating through some of these cross-cutting themes. And I think there's something in the word creation about being creative as well, and like kind of using the arts as so powerful as tools to, there's that left brain, right brain, I'm not sure which is which, but the one that's, opens up that more abstract, creative, imagination, thoughts. We can be very into laws and thinking about writing and policies and actually opening up our kind of creativity. So in my work, I use a lot of photography, photo voice, collage, rich picturing, accessible ways for people who don't consider themselves to be artists, but to be creative and to get thinking. And that really helps to build this element of co-creation. And then the third thing is around celebration. As Olivia said, actually part of this is about morale and keeping people's momentum going. This is hard work. So I've run things like awards where you can then showcase and amplify people's work so everyone knows what everyone's doing, and find that's good practice. But also I had awards where we reached out beyond the membership to other potential allies. So we ran a media awards. We had about people working with the media. So we worked with journalists who were reporting in ethical and progressive ways to celebrate and recognise what they were doing. So sort of reaching out to other sort of allies. And that might be employers, it might be companies, it might be other people. And the reason I put the little cakes that we had with the CJA thing on it is because I think there's something also about the brand of the alliance and people feeling like they belong to a thing, to a brand, to something that they can connect with. So I think that's a really important part of the picture as well. So moving on to power. So what is power? Who has power? Whose power is valued? There's been some really good work about this by the Sheila McKechnie Foundation in the UK and Just Associates based in India, do a lot of work in the migration space, thinking about this idea of power, because power infuses, you've already heard this morning, thinking about power dynamics as well, was talking about, what does that look like within the alliance and more broadly. So we've got sort of this nested, like individual power, sort of our collective power, civil society's power, and then the institutional power. And often, this power, this sort of institutional power, is sort of power over. So you're feeling, kind of that's when you get, feelings of being oppressed, of that's sort of done to rather than done with. And what Just Associates have talked a lot about is developing a kind of a power matrix, which I think is really helpful at helping think about different types of power that maybe aren't so obvious. So you've got the kind of visible power, where you kind of make and enforce the rules. But then you've also got hidden power. So you've got, who sets the agenda, who's included, who's excluded, a bit more sort of hidden. And then you've got that kind of invisible power, that sort of what's the culture, what's the values of an organisation. So these sort of power dynamics working on different levels. And I think within an alliance, it's trying to move from that kind of power over to doing, to these powers, so helping people to find the power within, so the power to hope or dream, power with, so finding common ground, building solidarity, power to, and power for, so this idea of kind of combining that sort of collective agenda, so thinking about how do we do power, how do we shift these power dynamics in order so that we can then join forces to start to influence that kind of broader societal power. Some of you may have seen this before, the 6 conditions of system change. Again, another model that I find really useful from systems thinking. And this idea of sort of power dynamics being a really key element of system change. And so one of the things that I did when I was at the Criminal Justice Alliance was draw an inspiration from the US, from Just Leadership USA, who had a whole program about building the skills, capacity, networks of justice impacted people. And I loved what they were doing, and so we took inspiration from that. We didn't just plonk the model into the UK, but we spent a lot of time doing peer research, doing co-design with people with lived experience about what that programme would look like, what are the needs in the UK. And then we developed Elevate, which was a 2-year leadership programme, 12 months with residentials, with other support to really kind of build the leadership capacity of people with lived experience in the UK, who were working already in the sector but had a glass ceiling. I think we had one person who'd been in the role for about 15 years working in sort of peer mentoring, and no one had said, well, what else could you do? How else could you get involved with policy, with journalism, with research, and all these others, so to open horizons as to how you can use that lived expertise in different ways. And many of them have gone on now to form global networks as well as national networks through the Global Freedom Fellowship, through other sort of global networks. So this is them standing outside number 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister's residence, in the last couple of months with the Prisons Minister. So collectively influencing change. And so I think there's a role for alliances to think about pathways and progression routes. This is how we're going to build power, as to how we can build power within individuals, particularly those with expertise, but actually all of the members, so that we're building this whole kind of generation of change makers with all those capacities. And then lastly, resources. So what are resources, who has resources, and what resources are valued? So I guess financial resources is the ones that come to mind, and we talked about things like funding this morning. And I've worked with networks and alliances where it's tricky because you've got members who are actually in competition with each other sometimes for those same pots, small pots of resources. And so that can be really tricky. And so I think there's some different things that alliances can do to help. So I think there's something about sort of increasing the size of the pie for everybody. So it's that amplifying role again to kind of think, how do we get more resources, financial resources, into the sector? How can we amplify at that level? We did some work when I was at the Prisoner Learning Alliance, where a lot of small-scale NGOs weren't able to get funding. It was the bigger NGOs that were getting the funding. And so we worked with government to change those funding mechanisms to enable those smaller organisations, those more working with different quality groups, for example, so that they could more equally get access to those funds. And going out and talking to other funders and getting more resource into the sector. Well, I think there's a role, often with alliances we'll come with our hats on, everyone's talked about their organisations that they're doing, and sometimes we can have that kind of sort of interest. We need to turn that into that collective interest, so it's sort of bringing the expertise from that organisation, absolutely, but sort of taking off that, that institution hat and then being part of that collective. And like Olivia was talking about, seeing that bigger vision, that bigger picture, so that, as was talked about this morning, that there's not duplication happening. Actually, if you're more aware of each other, then are we wasting resources by duplicating efforts? How can we support people to form those connections, to collaborate, to pool their resources together more? But also, there are non-financial resources, and I think this is what we forget a lot of the time. There's huge amounts of resources that we bring, whether that's imagination, motivation, time, hope, solidarity, innovation, and I think alliances can build social capital as a resource. So really thinking clearly about identifying our non-financial resources. I just wanted to finish with a quote from civil rights activist and organiser in the US, Marshall Gantz, from his book People, Power, Change, which is excellent. And he talks about strategy as turning what we have, knowledge and resources, into what we need, power, to get what we want, change. So I think these discussions over the next 2 days can help us think more clearly about identifying the knowledge and resources that we have between us as an alliance. How do we use that to get the power in order to make the change that we want to see. So yeah, I think there's, in order for us to flourish and to blossom, we think about building, sharing and mobilising knowledge, power and resources. And yeah, that's my LinkedIn and my email, and I'd love to chat to you all over the next couple of days and do a big chat. So thank you very much.